They told her a woman's place was beside the stove, so she took that stove, bolted it to a wagon, and drove it straight into the middle of 1,000 hungry men who hadn't eaten a real meal in weeks. What happened next didn't just save one failing ranch. It broke a powerful man's career, fed an entire frontier, and turned a mail-order bride. A woman nobody wanted, nobody believed in, nobody even bothered to learn her name, into the most feared entrepreneur in Wyoming territory. This is that story. Stay until the end. And drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The train pulled into Cutter's Bend, Wyoming on a Tuesday morning in late April of 1883, and it arrived 40 minutes late, which meant Evelyn Mercer had 40 extra minutes to reconsider every decision she had made in the past 6 months. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her single trunk wedged beneath the wooden bench seat, and she watched the flat brown landscape scroll past the smudged window like a painting done by someone who had given up halfway through. No trees to speak of. No softness anywhere. Just sage and rock and the occasional bleached skull of something that hadn't survived its own stubbornness. She was 26 years old. She had $43, a trunk containing her mother's cast iron skillet, 2 dresses, a packet of letters from a man she had never met, and a recipe book that was falling apart at the spine. The man's name was Wade Callahan. He had written to her through a correspondence service in St. Louis, the kind with a small advertisement in the back of the newspaper that promised opportunity and adventure and a fresh start in the West. His letters had been brief. Not cold exactly, but practical. He needed someone who could cook for the ranch hands. His mother had passed the previous winter. The ranch was, and here he'd used a word that Evelyn would later understand was the understatement of the decade, struggling. He had not promised love. He had not promised much of anything beyond a roof, food, and the legal protection of his name. Evelyn, who had spent the last 3 years cooking in a St. Louis boarding house for 12 men who treated her like furniture, had decided that was enough. She told herself that several times during the train ride. It's enough. A roof, a name, it's enough. The train lurched to a stop. Outside, Cutter's Bend wasn't much. A main street of maybe 8 buildings, a water tower, a livery, and a general store with a faded sign. A few men stood on the platform looking at the train the way men look at things they are mildly disappointed by. Evelyn gathered her coat, reached under the bench for her trunk, and discovered that it was heavier than she remembered. She wrestled with it for a moment before a porter appeared, expression completely blank, and carried it to the platform without being asked or thanked. She stepped down onto the wooden planks and looked around. There was a man leaning against a post at the far end of the platform. He was tall, wide in the shoulders, wearing a hat that had been through too many seasons. His arms were crossed. He was not exactly watching her, but he wasn't not watching her either. It was the look of a man who has made a decision and is already halfway to regretting it. That, she thought, must be Wade Callahan. She walked toward him. He didn't move to meet her. When she got close enough to see his face clearly, square jaw, a few days of stubble, eyes that were a flat sort of gray-green, the color of the sage outside the train window. He looked her over once, quickly, the way you'd assess a horse at market. "Miss Mercer," he said. Not a question. "Mr. Callahan." She extended her hand. He shook it. His hand was rough as tree bark and twice as hard. "Wagon's out front. We've got a long ride." He picked up her trunk without asking if she needed help and walked around the side of the station. She followed. "How long?" she asked. 2 hours, give or take. "And the ranch?" "It's there." She waited for more. More did not come. They rode for nearly the full 2 hours in a silence that Evelyn spent alternately studying the landscape and studying the side of Wade's face, trying to read something in it. He drove the horses with the focus of a man who had learned not to think about things too much. Every now and then his jaw tightened and then released, like something was turning over behind his eyes. But he kept it internal. He was good at that, she could already tell. The kind of man who processed things alone in the dark and presented the finished result to the world without showing any of the working. She didn't push it. She'd had enough of men who talked endlessly and meant nothing. Quiet, she could work with. What she wasn't prepared for was the ranch itself. She'd built a picture in her head during the train ride. Not grand, she wasn't naive, but solid. A working ranch. Fences in reasonable repair. Horses in a paddock. Men with something purposeful about their movement. What she got was different. The Callahan Ranch sat in a long valley with a creek on the east side that had clearly been fuller once, judging by the dried scar of its old banks. The main house was 2 stories, wood frame, the paint long gone to gray and peeling at the corners. One of the porch steps was broken, a board just hanging. The barn beyond it was larger and better maintained because Wade Callahan, she would learn, believed in his horses more than his house. There were 4 men in the yard when the wagon pulled in. They stopped what they were doing. One had been mending a fence post, one splitting wood, 2 doing something with a saddle that wasn't entirely clear. And they looked at her. Not unfriendly, but not warm either, measuring. "Boys," Wade said, climbing down from the wagon. "This is Miss Mercer. She's going to be handling the kitchen." He paused. "And other things." Other things. The way he said it was careful, like he hadn't quite figured out how to explain the mail order situation without it sounding exactly like what it was. The men nodded. The oldest one, a weathered fellow of maybe 60 with a white mustache and the posture of someone whose back had given up years ago, extended his hand. "Hector Pruitt," he said. "Cook was me before. I'll be honest with you, miss. I'm glad for the help." "Hector's been cooking since his wife left," said one of the younger ones, a lean fellow, maybe 22, with a quick smile. "Everything he makes tastes like something died in it." "Tom," Wade said, flat. Tom shrugged, still smiling. "Just setting her expectations, boss." The one who'd been splitting wood hadn't said anything. He was older than Tom, younger than Hector, with a broad, flat face and the look of a man who reserved judgment. He nodded at Evelyn once and went back to the wood. "That's Bert," Wade said. "He doesn't say much." "That's fine," Evelyn said. "I don't need much said." She got her first real look at the kitchen when Wade showed her inside. It was big enough. The room itself was generous, but it had been run into the ground. The stove needed a proper cleaning, and one of its legs had been propped up with a chunk of wood because the original foot had broken off. The shelves were badly organized, half the dry goods in paper bags that had gone soft and damp. A pot had been left unwashed long enough that whatever had been in it was now philosophical. She stood in the middle of it and looked around slowly. Wade stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands. "I know it's not much," he said. "It's workable," she said. "The pantry's through there. We've got flour, some salt pork, dried beans, beef when we slaughter." He paused. "The men eat twice a day. Breakfast before sunup, supper around 6. What do they eat now? Whatever Hector can manage. Which is? Beans, mostly. Biscuits on good days. Beef stew when we have fresh beef." Evelyn nodded slowly. "Where do you get your eggs?" "We've got 6 hens. 6 hens for how many people?" 7, including you." She thought about that. "And fresh vegetables?" "There's a kitchen garden. Wasn't tended much this winter." "All right," she set her jaw. "I'll need a list of what's actually in the pantry, everything, and I'll need to see what's in the garden." Wade put his hat back on. "Supper's at 6, he said. "I'll leave you to it." He walked out and she listened to his boots on the porch steps, the unbroken ones, and then the silence of the kitchen settled around her. The broken stove, the unwashed pot, the dying garden beyond the window. She rolled up her sleeves. She made biscuits, a proper beef broth with the bones she found wrapped in cloth in the cold storage, salt pork with onions from the sad little garden, and a dried apple cobbler that used the last of a tin of apples she found at the back of the pantry behind 3 bags of something that turned out to be weevil-infested cornmeal she threw out entirely. It wasn't her best work. She'd been on a train for 3 days and her back ached, and the stove ran uneven, hot on the left and barely warm on the right. But it was real food. The broth had depth, the biscuits were layered and brown, the pork had color and smell. When the men came in at 6, they sat down at the long table without ceremony, the way men who have eaten bad food for too long don't bother with optimism anymore. Then they tasted it. Tom ate his first biscuit in about 4 seconds and immediately reached for another without looking up. Hector tasted the broth and was quiet for a long moment. Bert ate steadily without expression, which Evelyn was already learning was his version of a standing ovation. Wade sat at the head of the table. He ate methodically, no rush, no particular expression. But when Evelyn came out from the kitchen to refill the bread plate, she caught him with his eyes closed for just a second, the way people close their eyes when something is better than they expected, and they don't want to admit it. Tom announced to no one in particular. Actually good. Like, a woman made this good. A woman did make it, Evelyn said, setting the plate down. I know, I meant... Tom stopped. Thank you, Miss Mercer. You're welcome, Tom. She went back to the kitchen. Through the door, she could hear the scrape of spoons, the occasional low word, the sound of men who were eating and not talking because eating was taking priority. It was the best compliment she knew. Wade came to the kitchen doorway when the others had gone. It was good, he said. The stove needs the broken foot replaced, she said, and I need to go through the pantry top to bottom tomorrow. He looked at her for a moment. Okay, and someone needs to fix that porch step. I almost went through it this afternoon. I'll have Bert look at it. She started washing up, her back to him. How much do you owe? The silence behind her changed quality. That's a direct question, he said. I'm a direct person. She kept washing. I saw the books on the desk when you showed me the house. I wasn't snooping. They were open. He didn't answer immediately. She could hear him weighing it, deciding how much truth a woman who'd known him for 6 hours was owed. More than we made last year, he finally said. About twice what we're likely to make this year if beef prices stay where they are. She set down the pot she was washing and turned around. How long before the bank calls it? He looked at the floor. First time she'd seen him look anywhere but straight ahead. Maybe a year. Maybe less. She nodded. All right, she said. Good night, Mr. Callahan. He blinked, as if he'd expected more. Good night, Miss Mercer. He left. She finished the washing up and stood alone in the kitchen for a while, looking at the broken stove leg propped on its chunk of wood, at the window with the cracked glass someone had patched with a strip of cloth, at the dark beyond the glass where Wyoming night had settled in without ceremony. A year, maybe less. She dried her hands on her apron and started thinking. 3 weeks passed. Evelyn learned the rhythms of the ranch the way she always learned a new kitchen, by being awake before everyone else, by paying attention, by keeping her conclusions to herself until she was certain of them. The Callahan Ranch ran cattle on about 800 acres, most of it leased from a land trust that had its own problems. They had 23 head of cattle, down from 40 the previous year, 2 having been lost to a bad winter and the rest sold to cover a debt payment. There were 8 horses, 4 working, and 4 that Wade was trying to sell through a contact in Laramie with limited success. They had the chickens, a pig, and a milk cow named June, who gave about half what a healthy cow should. The men? Tom, Bert, Hector, and a quiet younger hand named Cass, who had shown up the week after Evelyn arrived looking for work and been given a bunk and 50 cents a day. Worked hard, but without direction. Wade worked harder than any of them, up before first light, out until the light was gone. But he was working to survive rather than to build anything. And there's a difference. There's a kind of labor that's really just controlled panic, doing whatever the day demands without a plan behind it. And that's what was happening at the Callahan Ranch. The money was the problem. It was always the money. Cattle prices had fallen for 2 years running. Feed costs had gone up. The lease payment came due in October and then again in April. There was a loan from a Cheyenne bank with an interest rate that had seemed manageable once and now seemed designed to eat them alive. Evelyn watched all of this and said nothing. She made breakfast and supper. She fixed the pantry and organized the cold storage and replanted the kitchen garden with seeds she traded for with a woman in Cutter's Bend named Mrs. Hooper, who gave her pole beans and squash and tomato starts in exchange for a jar of the blackberry preserves Evelyn had made from wild berries she'd found along the creek. She got the stove leg properly repaired. She fixed the cracked window with actual glass rather than cloth. She listened to the men talk at supper. Heard there's 800 railroad men camped up near Flat Creek, Tom said one evening in mid-May, mopping up the last of a pork and bean gravy with a piece of bread. Building the spur line up to the timber country. I know, Wade said. Foreman came through last week looking for timber rights access through the east pasture. What'd you tell him? Told him we'd talk about it. They paying? Offering $50 for the season. Hector shook his head slowly. 800 men, he said. That's a city. That's a city with no place to eat, Tom said. I talked to one of the rail hands in town yesterday. Said they're living on hardtack and salt beef out of barrels. Man said half the crew's got stomach trouble. Railroad companies don't pay for food, Bert said. It was only the second time Evelyn had heard him volunteer information in 3 weeks. No, Tom agreed. They just pay for labor and let the men figure out the rest. The cook tent they got serves maybe 200 on a good day. Rest go without. Evelyn was washing a pot at the stove. She kept washing. 800 men. With no food. She turned the number over. The way they were camped, how long they'd be there, what a man who'd been swinging a sledgehammer since dawn would pay for a real meal. She didn't say anything at supper, but she went to bed thinking about it, and she was still thinking about it at 4 a.m. when she got up to start the bread. She let it sit for 2 weeks, because she had learned that ideas that feel urgent at 4 a.m. sometimes look stupid at noon. She watched the idea during those 2 weeks, turned it over, looked for the holes in it. The holes were real. She had no wagon of her own. She had limited capital. She'd have to buy more provisions than the ranch budget allowed. She'd need someone to drive the wagon. She'd need permits, or at minimum the goodwill of the railroad foreman. She'd need to cook enough food for, 50 men a day? 100? With what equipment? The holes were real, but none of them were fatal. She'd lived her whole adult life around fatal problems, and she knew the difference between a fatal problem and a solvable one. She waited until a Sunday evening, when supper was done and the men had drifted off and it was just her and Wade on the porch. He sat on the step with a cup of coffee, looking at nothing. She sat in the porch chair that had been patched with a piece of leather over the split seat. "I have an idea," she said. I want to hear what you think before I say more about it, but I want you to hear me out before you say no." He looked at her. "Why would I say no before I hear it?" "Because I know how you think," she said. "You think careful is safe. You've been careful for 2 years, and you're still losing." Something moved across his face. Not anger exactly, more like the look of a man who has just been handed a mirror unexpectedly. "All right," he said. "Tell me." She told him about the railroad camp, about 800 men eating from barrels, about the gap between what they had, a cook, a kitchen, some equipment, and what those men needed, about the possibility of taking a wagon out to the camp 3 times a week with hot meals. She did her numbers out loud. If 50 men paid 20 cents for a full meal, biscuits, meat, beans, coffee, that was $10. If she could serve 100 men, that was $20, 3 times a week, $60 a week. Against current ranch income of roughly $20 a week from whatever odd work and livestock sales they could manage, that's not a small thing, Wade said quietly. "No," she agreed. He was quiet for a long time. The evening settled around them, the horses moving in the paddock, the smell of sage. "You'd need a wagon," he said. "I'd need a wagon. We've got the old freight wagon, the one Bert uses for supply runs. It's not—" He thought about it. "It's not ideal." "I've seen worse kitchens," Evelyn said. He rubbed the back of his neck. The gesture she was learning meant he was working through something he didn't want to work through. "What are you going to cook on? You can't pull the house stove." "I know. There's a way to build a field range. It's just a heavy iron plate over a firebox, basically. Hector would know how to make one, or we could get a small camp stove from the supply depot in Laramie. That costs money we don't have." "It's an investment." "Everything's an investment until it isn't," he said, and his voice had an edge now, the edge of someone who has made investments that didn't pay. "I've tried things before, Evelyn. I tried running sheep for 2 years, lost half the flock to coyotes, tried a contract with a butcher in Cheyenne. Man went under before we got paid. Tried—" "I know," she said. "You don't know. You've been here 3 weeks. I know the shape of it," she said. "I know what trying and failing looks like in a man." She paused. "I also know what not trying looks like. The bank's going to call that loan. You know it. Another year of careful isn't going to change the number." He looked at his coffee cup. His jaw was tight. "It's my idea," she said. "It's my work. If it fails on me." "It fails on this ranch," he said. "On these men." "Yes." She didn't flinch from it. "Yes, it does. That's the risk. I'm not pretending otherwise." She leaned forward in the chair. "But Wade, these men are already failing. We're all already failing. The question isn't whether to risk something. The question is whether to do it on our own terms, or wait for the bank to do it for us." The night sounds filled the gap between them. Wade Callahan drank the rest of his coffee. He turned the empty cup in his hands a few times. She understood that, and so she waited and let the idea sit in the air between them without pushing it further. Finally, "I'll think about it," he said. It wasn't yes, but it wasn't no, and no was what she'd been braced for. She nodded and stood up, gathered her shawl against the evening chill. "One more thing," she said. He looked up. "If I do this, when I do this, I need to run it, not report to you about it, not get approval for every decision. I run it." He opened his mouth and closed it again. "You're my wife," he said. The word came out a little awkward, like he was still getting used to the shape of it. They'd been married by a justice of the peace in Cutter's Bend the morning after she arrived. A 7-minute ceremony with Hector as witness, practical as a handshake. "I'm your wife," she agreed, "and I'm also the person with the idea and the skills to execute it. Those aren't the same conversation." He looked at her for a long moment. Whatever he was looking for, he seemed to find something close enough to it. "Run it," he said. The freight wagon was worse than she'd feared and better than it had looked. Hector walked around it with her the next morning, poking at boards, testing the wheel bearings, bouncing on the platform. "Springs are gone in the rear left," he said. "Other than that, it's solid. Built to carry weight, this one. Douglas pine frame, iron banding. Old Pete Callahan, that's Wade's father. He bought this in 71, 18, 19 years on it, and it's still sound." "What would it take to make it into a cooking station?" Evelyn asked. Hector rubbed his white mustache. "Well, you'd need a fire platform in the back here that won't burn the wood. Iron sheet, maybe 1/4 inch, with a sand bed under it. You'd need some way to hang pots and keep them from swinging when you move. A shelf along the side here for supplies. A roof to keep rain off. Canvas on a frame? Nothing fancy. Maybe a fold-down counter on this side. Some hooks for tools. Can you build it?" He looked at her with something between surprise and pleasure. "Miss Evelyn, I spent 20 years before ranching as a wagon rights apprentice in Kansas City. I can build it. What do you need?" "Sheet iron, half a day in town, Bert's help, and about a week." She turned to Bert, who was leaning on the fence post watching them with his arms crossed. "Bert?" He considered. "I don't have anything pressing, can't wait a week." That was practically a speech from Bert. The wagon build took 9 days, not a week, because the iron sheet they got from the supply depot was the wrong gauge and had to be exchanged, and because Hector decided partway through that the canvas roof design wasn't right and rebuilt it with a steeper pitch so rain would run off properly. But when it was done, it was something. Evelyn stood behind the wagon and looked at what they'd made. The iron cooking platform sat on a proper sand bed at the rear, with iron rails on 3 sides to hold pots steady. 2 large hooks over the platform held the biggest pot she'd brought from the house, a 12-gallon bean pot that had been her mother's, and her own cast-iron skillet hung on a side hook within reach. The fold-down counter ran the length of the wagon's left side, held by 2 chains when down. The canvas roof covered the whole working area and could be rolled back in dry weather. It was rough. It listed slightly to the right because the bad spring hadn't been fully fixed, just shimmied. The counter's chains were mismatched, one being slightly longer than the other, so the counter tilted when loaded. The canvas had a patch on one end from where Hector had cut it wrong and had to add a piece. Tom came to look at it and walked around it twice. "She's ugly," he announced. "She works," Hector said. "Ugly and working is still ugly." "Ugly and working will do," Evelyn said. Tom grinned. "You know who else is ugly and working? Hector." Hector threw a rag at him. That evening, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with paper and a stub of pencil and worked out the numbers one more time, carefully. Cost of provisions per trip, estimated serving capacity, price per plate, time investment, fuel for the fire. She came to the same number she'd come to before. If it worked, if the railroad men would pay, and if she could serve enough of them, it worked well. The margin wasn't luxurious, but it was real money, weekly, which the ranch didn't have. She also wrote down the risks: competition from the railroad cook tent, bad weather, the foreman saying no, the men not wanting to pay, food spoilage on the ride out. Her own capacity. She couldn't cook for 500 men alone. That last one was the problem she hadn't solved yet. She thought about it through the night. In the morning, she went to Wade. "I need help," she said. "For the cooking. I can't do the volume alone." He was at the breakfast table, halfway through his coffee. I can't pull any of the men from ranch work. I'm not asking for the men. She sat down across from him. In town, there's a woman, Mrs. Hooper. I traded seeds with her. She's a widow. I've talked to her twice now. She's a good cook. She's got time, and she's not getting by. He looked at her carefully. You want to hire her? I want to offer her a share of the earnings. Not wages, a share. That way, if it doesn't make money, she's not out anything from us. If it does, she does well. He thought about it. Do you know her well enough to trust her? I know her well enough to know she's practical, she can cook, and she's tired of being poor, Evelyn said. That's enough for what I need. Wade was quiet for a moment. Who drives the wagon? I'll drive it. You know how? She gave him a look that made him clear his throat and look at his coffee cup. Cass can drive, he said, meaning the youngest hand. He's not pulling his weight anyway. I'll assign him to you for the days you run. She hadn't expected the offer. She absorbed it. All right. He stood up, hat in hand. When are you going to the camp? Friday, she said. The foreman's name is Hendricks. I'm going to ride out tomorrow and talk to him. Wade put on his hat. He might say no, he said. I know. And if he does? She picked up her coffee cup. Then I'll figure out another approach. He almost smiled. Just almost. All right, Evelyn. He went out to his day's work and she sat for a moment in the kitchen, her hands around the warm cup, the morning light coming through the new glass on the window. Friday, she thought. 5 days. She had a lot of cooking to do before Friday. She rode out to the railroad camp on Thursday morning on a steady gray mare named Ruth, following the wagon road northeast toward Flat Creek with a crock of biscuits and a jar of coffee she'd brewed strong and kept hot in a wrapped towel in her saddlebag. The camp was bigger than she'd imagined from Tom's description. It spread across nearly half a mile of the creek bank, rows of canvas tents, a smithy, a timber yard, a mule pen, a cook tent with a line of men outside it stretching 20 yards even at mid-morning. The sound of it reached her before she saw it. Hammers, mule teams, men calling to each other, the distant ring of steel on steel. The foreman, Hendricks, was a big man with a red face and the careful eyes of someone who has managed large groups of volatile people for a long time. He found her suspicious on sight, which she had expected. Mrs. Callahan, he said, looking at the horse, the crock of biscuits, the jar of coffee, and then at her. You want to feed my men? I want to sell food to your men, she said, 3 times a week. I'll bring the wagon out at noon and again at 6. Hot meals, beans, biscuits, meat when available, coffee always. 20 cents a plate. 20 cents? He crossed his arms. That's steep. The camp cook tent is serving how many men a day? He looked at her. Tom said about 200, she said. Your crew is 800. 600 men are going without a hot meal or buying from whatever they carry themselves. 20 cents for hot coffee and beans and biscuits isn't steep to a man who's been eating dry hardtack since Monday. Hendricks was quiet. Behind him, somewhere in the camp, a man was cursing at a mule with impressive creativity. I'm not responsible for any problems, he said finally. You come onto this camp, anything goes wrong. Goes wrong with me, she said. You just tell me where to set up. He studied her for another moment. East side, he said. By the timber yard. Out of the way of the main supply road. Agreed. She offered him the crock of biscuits and the coffee jar. He looked at them like it might be a trap. Try them, she said. Free. You should know what you're endorsing. He took a biscuit. He chewed it slowly, with the expression of a man who was trying very hard not to react. He poured coffee from the jar into his own tin cup and drank it. He looked at the remaining biscuits. You need them back, he said, meaning the crock. Keep them, she said. He nodded. Friday noon, he said. Don't be late. These men eat at noon and they're not patient about it. She rode back to the ranch with her hands steady on the reins and a thing happening in her chest that she hadn't felt in a long time. A kind of certainty that what you're about to do is exactly the right thing, that the road ahead is steep, but it goes somewhere. She was not a person who let herself feel that for long without checking it, turning it over for cracks. She'd been certain before and been wrong. She knew what wrong looked like, but this felt different. This felt like math that added up. She got home before noon and went straight to Mrs. Hooper's house in town, where she sat at the woman's kitchen table and laid out the numbers and asked if she was interested. Clara Hooper was 52 years old, solid as a fence post, with gray-streaked hair she kept in a tight braid, and hands that were chapped red from years of washing other people's things. She had been a widow for 4 years. She had 2 grown sons in Colorado who sent money when they remembered, which wasn't often enough. She listened to Evelyn's proposal with her hands folded on the table and her face showing nothing. When Evelyn finished, Clara said, "What's my share?" 20% of net after provisions. Clara thought about it. 25. Evelyn had expected 22. 25, she said. Clara unfolded her hands and put one of them across the table. They shook. "I'll be at your ranch at 4 tomorrow morning," Clara said. "We'll need to start the beans the night before." "I know," Evelyn said. "I already have them soaking." She didn't sleep the night before, or not much. She got up at 3, which was before even her usual 4, and went to the kitchen. The beans were soaking in their pots, 2 of them. She started the fire in the stove and began the biscuit dough. 12 dozen, she'd calculated, more than she thought they'd need, because she'd learned that it was better to cook too much than too little on a first run when you didn't know the demand. Clara arrived at 4 on the dot, in her good dress and a canvas apron over it, carrying her own rolling pin and a box of dried herbs. They cooked together in near silence, the way good kitchen workers do, each reading what the other was doing and moving around it without collision. Clara took the beans and added something to them, lard and a dried pepper and something else from her box that Evelyn later identified as smoked paprika, that deepened them in a way that Evelyn filed away immediately. At 8, they started loading the wagon. By 10, they were moving. Cass drove the wagon. He was 20 years old, thin, with a nervous energy to him, and he handled the horses with more confidence than he handled most social situations. The loaded wagon lurched on the bad spring, and Clara gripped the sideboard with one hand and looked at Evelyn. "Spring's shot," Evelyn said. "I noticed," Clara said. "Hector's going to fix it." "When?" "When we can afford the part." Clara looked ahead down the road. "So we're delivering hot food to 800 men in a wagon that lists to the right." "It won't spill," Evelyn said. "The pots are railed." Clara considered this. "All right," she said. They pulled into the camp at 5 minutes before noon. Hendricks met them at the east side perimeter and pointed them to a flat area near the timber yard where someone had already cleared a space. Evelyn was surprised. She hadn't expected that. "Word travels in a camp," Hendricks said, by way of explanation. "Men have been asking since yesterday." The line formed before they'd even properly set up. Men coming off their morning shift, still dusty and sweat-soaked, with coins ready in their palms. Evelyn worked the food end, bean ladle, biscuit handoff, while Clara kept the fire and the pots. Cass took money, which he was visibly nervous about and perfectly accurate with, each coin checked and pocketed before the next man stepped up. The first hour, the men were cautious. They came up, paid, took their plate, a tin one, each man brought his own, ate a few feet away, and watched. But the food was hot and real, and the biscuits were good, and by the second hour there was something different about the line. Men weren't just eating, they were lingering, talking to each other. A sound she recognized from the boarding house in St. Louis, the sound of men who have been fed and are now briefly human again. By the end of the first service, they had served 91 men. 91 men at 20 cents was $18.20. Minus their provisions cost of $4.50, their net was $13.70. She sat on the wagon's fold-down counter after the last man left and counted it out, coin by coin, into her palm. Clara sat beside her, arms folded, watching. "That's more than the ranch makes in 3 days," Evelyn said. Clara looked at the coins. "One service," she said. "You've got the evening service yet." The evening service brought 63 more men. The word had spread through the camp during the afternoon, and some of them had specifically come over from their tents to the timber yard. One man, a large Swede with a red beard, ordered 2 plates and paid double without blinking. Total for the day, $24.80 net. Evelyn folded the bills and the coins into the money pouch she wore inside her dress and rode back to the ranch in the wagon, with the evening fading around them. Clara sat beside her, rolling pin across her knees. "Same time Monday?" Clara said. "Same time Monday," Evelyn said. They rode in comfortable silence for a while. The stars were coming out over Wyoming, enormous and unceremonious. "Miss Evelyn," Clara said eventually. "Just Evelyn." "Evelyn," she paused. "We're going to need more biscuits next time." "I know. I'm going to need a second oven, or a faster hand, or both." Clara made a sound that was coming from her, approximately a laugh. They pulled into the ranch yard as the last light went out of the sky. Wade was waiting on the porch, not quite watching for them, but clearly not having gone to bed either. He looked at her face as she climbed down from the wagon, reading something in it. "Well?" he said. She walked to the porch and handed him the money pouch. He opened it. His expression changed. Not dramatically, not the way a lesser man would have shown it, but she saw it. Something loosened in his face that had been wound tight for a long time. "One day?" he said. "2 services," she said. "And that's 50% less than we'll do when the word's fully spread." He closed the pouch. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. He didn't say thank you. He wasn't built for that kind of declaration. But what he said was, "The spring on that rear left wheel. I talked to the smithy in town. He's got the part. I'll take it in Monday morning." It was, from Wade Callahan, practically a love letter. "Thank you," she said. He handed back the money pouch. "It's yours to manage," he said, and walked inside. Evelyn stood on the porch for a moment in the dark, listening to Wyoming breathe around her. Somewhere out in the pasture, June the milk cow was complaining about something, as she always was. The creek made its small sound in the east. Overhead, the stars just kept burning, indifferent and magnificent. She went inside. She had bean pots to soak for Monday. By the 3rd week, Evelyn had stopped counting individual plates. Not because the money didn't matter. It mattered enormously. It was the only thing standing between the ranch and the bank's patience running out. But because the numbers had gotten large enough that counting plates felt like counting individual drops of rain. She had started thinking in larger units, in days, in weeks, in what a month of this looked like, stacked against what they owed. The answer, when she worked it out on a Tuesday evening at the kitchen table with Wade sitting across from her pretending to read a livestock report while actually watching her pencil move across the paper, was better than she'd let herself hope for. 6 weeks at current volume, she said, without looking up, covers the April lease payment. Wade set down the livestock report. "You're sure?" "I'm sure of the math. I'm not sure of the volume staying constant." She looked up. "But Hendricks told me yesterday they've got another 4 months of work on the spur line before they move camp. If the volume holds, we pay the April payment and have something left over." He was quiet, which was his way of being loud. "The October payment," he said carefully, "is a different conversation." She tapped the pencil against the table. "One problem at a time." He nodded slowly. She could see him wanting to say something else, something cautionary, the way he always wanted to pull back from a good thing before it had a chance to turn bad on him. But he kept it to himself. He was learning, she thought, that she had already thought of the bad possibilities before he brought them up. She'd just chosen not to lead with them. What she didn't tell him, because she wasn't ready to say it out loud yet, was that she had already started thinking about the October payment too. And the answer she kept arriving at involved more wagons. The single wagon ran 3 times a week, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and each run served between 140 and 200 men depending on weather and shift schedules. On good days, the line stretched past where they could see it from the cooking platform. Men were turned away when the food ran out, which happened on 2 of the past 4 Fridays. And men who got turned away were not unhappy about it the way a man might be unhappy about a store being out of something he wanted. They were the particular kind of unhappy that comes from being hungry and watching other people eat, and Evelyn had seen that look enough in her life to take it seriously. She was losing money every time she ran out. Or rather, she was leaving money on the table, which felt the same. Clara had noticed it too. "We need to either bring more food," she said one Wednesday evening as they were cleaning up after the second service, "or come more often." "We should do both," Evelyn said. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and gave her a measuring look. "That means more cooking and more driving. You thinking about what that actually costs in time?" "I'm thinking about it constantly." Evelyn stacked the clean ladle on the wagon shelf. "I'm also thinking we can't keep turning men away. Word's going to spread in the wrong direction eventually. Men will stop coming if they think there won't be enough." "Already happening," Clara said. "I talked to that big Swede, such Magnus today. He said some of the men from the far end of camp don't bother walking over anymore. Evelyn felt it like a small drop in her stomach. How many men? He didn't know exactly. 30, 40. 30 or 40 men times 20 cents 3 times a week. She did it quickly in her head, and the number was not small. I need another pair of hands, she said. Clara looked at her steadily. You've got one pair of hands in mind already. It wasn't a question. Clara had gotten to know her well enough in 3 weeks to recognize when Evelyn arrived at a conversation having already thought it through to the end. There's a woman at the church. I don't go, but Mrs. Hooper mentioned her. Mrs. Dalka. Romanian, I think. Her husband was a miner, died last winter in a shaft collapse. She's got 2 children, and she's been taking in washing. Can she cook? I haven't tasted her food, but I've seen her. She moves like someone who knows a kitchen. Evelyn picked up her jacket. And she needs the work more than she's willing to say, which means she'll work hard. Clara was quiet for a moment. You're building something, she said. The way she said it wasn't quite a question and wasn't quite a statement. It had the tone of someone watching a structure going up and trying to decide whether it's going to stand. I'm trying to, Evelyn said. She went to see Anna Dalka the following morning. The woman lived in a small house on the edge of Cutter's Bend, the kind of small that had been arrived at by subtraction. Things removed as they couldn't be maintained, furniture sold, rooms closed off against the winter heating costs. She answered the door in a clean dress with her dark hair pulled back and her 2 children, a boy of maybe 8 and a girl younger, visible behind her looking at Evelyn with frank curiosity. Evelyn told her what she needed. Anna listened without expression. When Evelyn finished, Anna said, How much? And Evelyn told her. Anna thought for a moment, her dark eyes level and calm. I need to bring my children on the days I work, she said. I have no one to leave them with. The ranch has a yard, Evelyn said. They'll be fine. Anna nodded once, the kind of nod that closes a decision. Monday, she said. The expansion of the operation, because that was what it was, an expansion, even if no one had officially called it that, didn't happen all at once. It happened the way most things built by practical people happen, piece by piece, each piece addressing the most immediate problem, with the larger shape emerging slowly from the accumulation of solutions. The second wagon problem resolved itself in a way Evelyn hadn't anticipated. Tom came to her on a Thursday morning while she was in the kitchen garden, pulling weeds from around the bean rows. He stood at the edge of the garden with his hat in his hands, turning it in circles, which was his tell for being nervous. I wanted to ask you something, he said. Ask it, she said without stopping her weeding. My uncle's got a wagon he's not using, over in Rawlins. It's old, but it runs, and I was thinking... He stopped, started again. I was thinking I could drive it, for the camp runs. I'm not pulling my weight on the ranch right now, and Wade knows it. There's just not enough work for 5 men when the herd's this small, and I know the road to the camp, and I'm a decent driver. Evelyn sat back on her heels and looked at him. Tom was 22 and had a quick mouth and a quicker grin, and she had spent the past 3 weeks watching him around the ranch, the way he moved, what he paid attention to, how he handled the horses. He was not lazy. She'd identified early that his easy manner concealed someone who worked hard when the work was worth something to him. He just needed a reason. You want a wage or a share? She said. He blinked. He'd expected more pushback, she could tell. What's the difference? A wage is a wage. Same every week. Doesn't matter how we do. A share means if we have a good week, you make more. If we have a bad week, you make less. He thought about it. Share, he said. I like a gamble. It's not a gamble if you work it right, she said, and went back to her weeding. Go get the wagon from Rawlins. I want to see it before I decide. He went. He came back 2 days later with a wagon that was indeed old and indeed ran, a short bed freight model with mismatched horses that Tom had borrowed from the same uncle and refused to elaborate on. Hector inspected it and declared it structurally adequate with notable reservations about the left rear axle. They reinforced the axle, built a second cooking platform smaller than the first, and added a canvas cover that matched neither in size nor color the original wagon's cover, so that when the 2 wagons sat side by side, they looked like something assembled from spare parts, which they were. It was inelegant. It worked. With 2 wagons, Evelyn moved the schedule to 5 days a week, keeping Sunday and Saturday morning as rest and prep days. She assigned Tom and Cass to the second wagon, with Anadalka doing the cooking on that unit while Clara stayed with Evelyn on the original. The second wagon ran the far end of the camp where the men who'd stopped coming were, and on its first day out, it served 80 men who had not bought a meal from them in 2 weeks. That evening, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with her ledger. A proper one now, bought from the general store, not just loose paper, and worked the week's numbers. The expansion had cost money up front, the axle repair, the new canvas, provisions for higher volume, Anna's share. But the net for the week was $94. $94. In 1 week. She wrote the number and looked at it for a while. Then she thought about what she should do with it, and the answer came the same way answers always came to her. She should put most of it back into the operation and keep just enough in reserve to cover the ranch's immediate expenses. Not because she was reckless, she was the least reckless person she knew, but because the operation was the ranch's future now, and a thing with a future needs to be fed. She was working that out on paper when Wade came in from the evening check on the horses. He looked at her, then at the ledger, then poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove and sat down. "I'd like to hire a second full-time hand," he said. She looked up. "For the ranch?" "For whatever needs doing. The herd's going to start picking up if the price recovers, and I've been losing half a day a week to supply runs because I can't spare anyone." He paused. "Also, the fence on the south pasture needs a proper rebuild. Bert and I can't do it alone." "How much?" 50 cents a day. She thought about it. "Agreed, if you find the right person. Not just anyone." "I know the difference," he said mildly. "I know you do." She looked back at the ledger. "There's a man who's been hanging around the lumberyard in town. Used to work for the Hendersons before they sold. Name's Dolan. He came by twice asking about work." "I know Dolan. He drinks." "He drinks on weekends," she said. "During the week, he's reliable. The Hendersons told me so." Wade raised an eyebrow. "When did you talk to the Hendersons?" "Last Thursday, when I was in town for provisions." She turned a page in the ledger. "I talk to people, Wade. It's how you find things out." He was quiet for a moment. "All right, I'll talk to Dolan." They sat in the kitchen together with the night outside the window, each doing their separate thinking. It was something she had come to value, these evenings. Not because they were warm and comfortable, though sometimes they were, but because there was something in sitting at the same table with a person working through the same problem from different angles. Marriage, she was learning in its practical form, was less like love stories suggested and more like a good working partnership. Two people who have decided to throw in together and figure out the daily mechanics of that as they go. She didn't love him yet. She wasn't sure she'd know what that felt like when it arrived, but she trusted him, which felt more durable. He didn't love her either, she was fairly certain, but she had caught him watching her sometimes. Not the assessing look from the train platform, something else, something that hadn't quite decided what it was, and she had filed it away without examining it too closely. They had time, or they'd have time if the operation kept working. One thing at a time. The thing nobody had predicted, including Evelyn, was how quickly word spread outside the railroad camp. It was Magnus who started it, the big Swede with the red beard who'd been their first double-plate customer. He had a brother-in-law working a timber crew 15 miles north, and the brother-in-law came through the camp one Sunday, and Magnus told him about the food wagon, and the brother-in-law mentioned it to the timber crew foreman, and the foreman sent a man to find the Callahan operation the following week. The man arrived at the ranch on a Wednesday morning while Evelyn was loading provisions for the day's run. He was maybe 40, lean, with the deliberate manner of someone used to delivering messages accurately. He introduced himself as Pierce, said he worked for the Northern Timber Company, and said that his foreman had sent him to inquire whether Mrs. Callahan's food service could be extended to their crew. Evelyn looked at him over a crate of flour. "How many men?" "About 90. We're stationary. Same camp for another 6 months at least." "How far?" 15 miles north by the main road, 12 cutting through the Henderson land if you've got access." "I don't have access to the Henderson land." She hoisted the flour crate into the wagon. 15 miles is a long drive. The food quality suffers past about 10. What would make the quality not suffer? She thought about it. It was a practical question deserving a practical answer. A better insulated transport box for the beans and meat, biscuits baked closer to service time. She thought some more. I'd need to find somewhere to finish cooking closer to your camp, a fire site we could use consistently. Pierce looked at her steadily. We've got a cleared area with a fire ring near the camp perimeter. Used to be for a smithy. The smithy moved on. The ring's still there. Then I'd need to do a partial cook here and finish at the site. She worked through the timing in her head, which took about 30 seconds. That adds time and fuel cost. I'd need 25 cents a plate for that run. Pierce didn't flinch. I'll tell the foreman 25 cents. Tell him it's 25 cents and worth it, she said. I don't discount quality. He almost smiled. Yes, ma'am. She added the timber crew run on Tuesdays and Thursdays, with Tom driving the second wagon on a modified route that came back through town to restock before heading north. The timing was brutal in the first 2 weeks. Tom was running 15 hours some days, and Evelyn herself was waking at 2:30 to get a head start on the quantities. But the revenue from the timber crew alone covered June's share of the lease payment in its first week. The men who had mocked her were not mocking her now. It happened gradually enough that she almost missed it. The shift from tolerance to something closer to respect, or at least to the kind of professional regard that men extend to someone who is clearly producing results. Tom had never been hostile exactly, but he'd had that quality of a young man around a woman of capability, a slight defensiveness, a need to establish his own competence nearby. That faded. He started asking her questions, practical ones about pricing and route planning, the way you ask questions of someone whose judgment you've decided to trust. Bert had never said much and still didn't, but there was a difference in his silences now. Before, his silence around her had been the silence of a man waiting to see if she'd stay. Now it was something else. More like the silence of someone who has decided you're worth the air you take up and doesn't feel the need to announce it. Hector was the simplest. He had been on her side from the first supper, and now he helped wherever she needed him, fixing equipment, modifying the wagons, sometimes doing the pre-dawn prep if she was handling an inventory question that had kept her up past midnight. He moved through her operation like someone who had finally found work that matched the size of his experience, and he was better than she'd expected, which meant he was very good. Even Dolan, the new hand Wade had hired, who had nothing to do with the food operation and whose business it wasn't, treated her with a straightforward respect that suggested Wade had said something to him before he started, though when she asked, Wade said he hadn't. Don't need to say anything, Wade said. They can count. They know what the operation's making. They know what I'm making for this ranch, she said. That shouldn't be what earns me respect. He looked at her. No, he said. It shouldn't, but it's what broke through first. The rest'll take longer. It was an honest answer. She had known it already, but she appreciated him saying it plainly. What she was less prepared for was the women. Clara had told Mrs. Hooper about the timber crew expansion, and Mrs. Hooper, who was connected to every household in Cutter's Bend, the way a root system connects trees, had told people. And one morning in the 6th week, Evelyn came out of the house to find 3 women sitting on the porch steps. They were different ages. One young, maybe 19, one middle-aged, one older than Clara. And they had in common a kind of careful dignity that comes from having less than you need and refusing to let it show. The young one spoke first. We heard you're hiring. Evelyn looked at them. Who told you that? Mrs. Hooper. She hadn't told Mrs. Hooper she was hiring. She'd mentioned to Clara that if the timber run kept growing, she might need another hand. Clara had mentioned it to Mrs. Hooper. Mrs. Hooper had apparently taken this as a public announcement. She looked at the 3 women on her porch steps. Behind them, Anna's children were chasing the ranch cat across the yard. Somewhere in the kitchen, she could hear Clara's steady rhythm at the stove. She thought about what her own life had looked like 2 months ago. $43 and a trunk and a train window full of brown nothing. Come inside, she said. Tell me what you can do. The older woman, her name was Ruth, same as the gray mare, which struck Evelyn as either coincidence or fate, and she tried not to read anything into it either way, had spent 20 years cooking for a logging camp in Oregon before her husband brought her to Wyoming and died of a bad winter. She had not cooked professionally since, she said, because there was no one who'd hire a woman of 61 for professional kitchen work. Evelyn hired her on the spot, not out of sentiment, though she wasn't without it, because Ruth described the way she managed a large volume bean pot, timing, seasoning, temperature management, with the precision of an engineer, and Evelyn recognized immediately that this was someone who understood food at a structural level. The middle-aged woman's name was Gertrude. She had 5 children and a husband with a bad leg who couldn't do heavy work. She was not an exceptional cook, but she was organized, reliable, and had already calculated the travel distance from her house to the ranch before she sat down on the porch step, which told Evelyn the things she needed to know about her. The young one, Grace, was 19 and had come out to Wyoming with a fiancé who had gone to work on the railroad and not come back, not dead, just gone in the way that some men go. She could bake, she said specifically. Bread and pastry she had learned from a grandmother in Pennsylvania. Evelyn walked to the kitchen and came back with yesterday's dinner roll. She handed it to Grace. "Tell me what's wrong with it." Grace ate it carefully, thought. "Too much salt, and it was baked too hot. The crust is hard, but the inside's still a little dense. It needed another 20 minutes at lower temperature." She was right on all 3 counts. "Can you start Thursday?" Evelyn said. Wade found her that evening in the kitchen going over the staffing numbers, and he stood in the doorway looking at the additions she'd made to the ledger with an expression she was learning to read. Not alarm exactly, but the particular unease of a man watching something grow faster than he'd anticipated. "3 more women," he said. "Ruth, Gertrude, and Grace." Yes. "We're a ranch, Evelyn." She looked up. "We're a ranch that's going to pay its lease payment 8 weeks early and its bank payment 3 months early if this volume holds," she said. "At some point you have to ask what we are and what we could become, and those might not be the same thing." He opened his mouth and closed it. He came in and poured himself coffee and sat down and looked at the ledger page she'd been working. The numbers were not ambiguous. They hadn't been ambiguous for weeks. "The ranch is still the ranch," he said finally, and there was something careful in his voice, like he was working out what he actually meant by that. "The cattle, the land, that doesn't change." "I know," she said. "The ranch is the ranch. This is something else that's growing next to it." She turned the ledger to face him. "The ranch keeps you standing. This might let you stand up straight." He looked at the numbers for a long time. His coffee went cold while he sat there. "We're going to need a bigger cold storage," he said finally. She had already looked into the cost of expanding the cold storage. "Yes," she said. "I found a man in Laramie who does the work. He's cheaper than anyone in town by about 30%. Wade raised an eyebrow. "How'd you find him?" "Pierce mentioned him, the timber company man." She turned the ledger back toward herself. "He's coming out Friday to give an estimate." Wade looked at her with that look she still hadn't entirely mapped. Not quite surprise, not quite admiration. Some combination of both with something quieter underneath. "You've been busy," he said. "I've been trying to keep up," she said, which was true. The operation was moving faster than she'd planned for, faster than she was entirely comfortable with, which meant there were things happening at the edges she hadn't fully gotten her arms around yet. That was the part she didn't say out loud. She could hold the shape of it for now, but the shape was getting larger. What she didn't know yet, and wouldn't know for another 3 weeks, was that someone else was watching the shape get larger too. Someone who had been watching it since about the 4th week, who had noted the growing lines at the railroad camp, who had received a report from a man he kept at the camp for exactly this kind of intelligence gathering. Someone who had looked at what Evelyn Mercer Callahan had built in 6 weeks out of a broken wagon and a cast-iron skillet, and had thought not that it was impressive, but that it was valuable. And that valuable things, in his experience, could always be acquired. His name was Victor Sloan. He was the regional director of operations for the Continental Western Railroad, and he had a particular talent for seeing what things were worth and a particular habit of taking them. He had not introduced himself yet. He would soon enough. For now, on a warm evening in late June, Evelyn sat at her kitchen table with Ruth on one side going over the week's supply list, and Clara on the other hand, writing the Tuesday menu on a piece of brown paper, and Grace was in the corner testing a new biscuit formula with a spare patch of dough, and Anna's children were asleep in the spare room because Anna had stayed late to help with the cold storage reorganization, and the ranch house smelled of coffee and flour and the faint char of a well-used iron stove. It was loud with women's work, her kitchen, loud with purpose, and the small negotiations of people who are building something together without having agreed to call it that. She looked around at all of it. She felt the satisfaction of it, the specific satisfaction of a thing that is working. She let herself feel it for a minute, the way she'd learned to let herself have good things. Briefly, completely, then set it down and get back to the problem in front of her. The problem in front of her was the supply list, and whether they could get a better price on salt pork if they ordered in bulk from the depot in Laramie. She picked up her pencil. The bulk order from Laramie came through on a Thursday, which was the same day Victor Sloan arrived at the Callahan Ranch. She had not been expecting either, exactly. The supply delivery had been confirmed, but the date had been vague, and Sloan had not been expected at all. She was in the yard helping Hector unload the first wagon from the morning timber run when a black carriage came up the road from Cutter's Bend, moving with the particular deliberateness of something expensive. The horses were matched bays, which is the kind of detail you notice in Wyoming in 1883 because matched horses mean someone spent money on appearance when appearance wasn't necessary, and that tells you something about the person inside. The carriage stopped. A man got out. He was somewhere between 50 and 60, thick through the chest and shoulders in a way that suggested he'd once been physically powerful and had since shifted that power into other expressions of itself. His suit was dark wool, well cut, carrying a light layer of road dust that hadn't bothered him enough to brush off, which meant he was either indifferent to appearances or confident enough that he didn't need them to do work for him. He had a broad face, a neat gray mustache, and the eyes of someone who has spent a career calculating what things are worth. He looked at the wagon, the yard, the house, Hector, and then Evelyn in about 4 seconds. "Mrs. Callahan," he said. Not a question. She set down the crate she was holding. "That's right." Victor Sloan, Continental Western Railroad, Regional Operations. He came forward and extended his hand, a gesture that was either respectful or performative, and she couldn't yet tell which. "I was hoping to speak with you and your husband. My husband's in the south pasture." She shook his hand once, brief. "I handle the operation. You can speak with me." Something moved in his eyes. Not offense, exactly, more like a recalibration. He was the kind of man who recalibrated smoothly. "Of course," he said. "Is there somewhere we can sit?" She took him to the kitchen, not the front room, which was a deliberate choice. The kitchen was where she worked. She wasn't going to shift into guest hosting mode for a man who'd arrived without an invitation. Clara was there finishing the morning cleanup, and she looked at Sloan once with the flat assessment of a woman who has met many types of men and filed most of them in the same drawer, then finished what she was doing and went out without being asked. Evelyn poured coffee. Not as hospitality exactly, as occupation, something to do with her hands while she figured out what this man wanted. He sat at the table and folded his hands on it and looked around the kitchen with the same calculating attention he'd given the yard. "You've built something impressive here, Mrs. Callahan, in a very short time." "Thank you," she said, and waited. He appreciated directness. She could see that. He had the rhythm of someone who preferred to skip the warm-up, too. "I'm going to be equally direct with you. Continental Western has been watching your operation for about 3 weeks. The volume you're doing at the Flat Creek camp is significant, and I understand you've recently expanded to the Northern Timber Crew as well." "We have," she said. "My company is building 4 more camps in this territory over the next 18 months. 2 spur lines east of here and a main line extension north. Each camp will have between 500 and 1,000 men." He paused, letting the numbers sit. "That's a substantial market." She said nothing. She drank her coffee. "We would like to offer you a contract," Sloan said. "An exclusive supply arrangement. Your operation provides food services to all Continental Western camps in the territory. We simplify your logistics, designated supply access, fixed camp locations, set schedules. You simplify ours. No need for us to manage a cook tent at each site." He reached into his jacket and produced a folded document, set it on the table between them. "We think it's an arrangement that benefits both parties." She looked at the document, did not pick it up. "What's the contract price?" 15 cents per meal served." Her coffee cup was halfway to her mouth. She set it down. "We currently charge 20 cents at the railroad camp and 25 at the timber crew. You're currently a small independent operation," he said pleasantly. "A contract with Continental Western means guaranteed volume. No uncertainty about whether men will show up. No competition from other suppliers." He gestured at the document. "The security has value." "The security has value to you," she said. "You want guaranteed service. What I have is guaranteed demand. Those men are hungry, whether or not I have a contract. Reducing my price by 5 to 10 cents per plate is not a benefit to me. It's a benefit to your company. Sloane's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. It's a starting point, he said. Obviously, there's room to discuss the terms. She pulled the document toward her, unfolded it, and read it. She was not a fast reader. Her schooling had been inconsistent, a problem she'd worked on steadily for years through practice. But she read carefully. She went through the document twice, and what she found in the second reading was the part that mattered more than the price: exclusivity. The contract required her to serve Continental Western camps exclusively. She could not sell to any other railroad operation, any timber crew, any independent labor camp without Continental Western's written approval. She set the document down. "This exclusivity clause," she said, "you're asking me to give up my current timber contract and any future non-railroad business. The Continental Western volume would more than compensate." "That's not the point." She kept her voice level. "You're asking me to make my entire operation dependent on one company's decisions. If Continental Western changes its terms next year, or decides to rebuild the cook tent, or simply decides not to renew, I've lost everything." Sloane clasped his hands. "We're a stable company, Mrs. Callahan. We're not going anywhere." "Every company says that." He looked at her for a moment. She had the sense that most of his negotiations went faster than this one. "I understand your concern. These things can be negotiated." "What's your timeline?" she asked. "When do you need an answer?" "I'll be in the territory for another week. I'd like to have this resolved before I leave." He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it down. "I'll be at the Prescott Hotel in Cutter's Bend. I hope you'll give it serious consideration." She walked him to his carriage. He got in with the ease of a man who has never had to think about how he moves through the world. The matched bays waited without fidgeting, well-trained. "Mrs. Callahan," he said from the carriage window, "this is a good opportunity for a woman in your position. I'd hate to see you pass it by." She held the carriage door. "What position is that, Mr. Sloane?" He smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him, and it was not a warm one. "A small operation that's grown quickly. Fast growth creates vulnerabilities. A contract like this is protection." "Or a cage," she said pleasantly, and closed the carriage door. She stood in the yard watching the carriage go back down the road until it disappeared. Then she went inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hands on the table, looking at the document he'd left. 15 cents. Exclusivity. 1 year initial term, renewable at Continental Western's discretion. She had 3 hours before the afternoon's provisions needed to be prepped. She spent one of them reading the document again, more slowly, making notes in the margins with her pencil. Then she went out to find Wade. He was where she'd expected him, mending fence in the south pasture with Dolan, the afternoon heat making the work look harder than it was. He saw her coming and said something to Dolan, who took his tools to the far section of fence with the social awareness of a man who has worked long enough around married people to know when he's not needed. She told Wade about Sloane. She told him about the contract, the price, the exclusivity. She watched his face while she talked. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she valued about him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, turning a piece of wire in his hands. 15 cents is a cut, he said. It's a 25% cut at the railroad camp rate. But the volume would go up. Maybe. He's promising future camps that don't exist yet. I'd be locking in a lower rate now against a promise of future volume. She shook her head. And the exclusivity kills the timber business. Pierce has been talking about expanding their crew. That's revenue I'd be walking away from. Wade turned the wire once more and set it down. What did you say to him? I said I'd think about it. Are you going to? She looked at the fence line, the flat distance of the pasture beyond it, the familiar sagebrush geometry of Wyoming afternoon. I'm thinking about it right now, she said. What I keep coming back to is that he came to us. He didn't have to. He could have gone around us, built his own operation from scratch. He came here because it's easier and cheaper to buy what we've already built than to build it himself. That's a negotiating position, Wade said. It is, but he structured the contract to look like he's doing us a favor. 15 cents isn't a fair price. It's the price he offers to someone who doesn't know their own value. She met his eyes. We know our value. He was quiet for a moment. The afternoon wind moved through the sage. So you're going to counter? I'm going to counter, she said. 18 cents, no exclusivity, or 20 cents with exclusivity limited to anything else that isn't their direct operation, and a 2-year locked rate so they can't drop us next season. Wade looked at the ground, then at her. And if he says no, then he says no, and we keep doing what we're doing. He might do more than say no, Wade said. His voice had gone careful, the way it went when he was working through something he didn't want to say. She looked at him. What do you mean? A man like that doesn't come all this way to get told no and go home. He picked up the wire again, not because he needed it, just to have something in his hands. He's got leverage we don't have yet. He can make things difficult at the camp. Talk to Hendricks. Change access policy. She had thought of this. She hadn't said it out loud because she'd been hoping she was wrong. Looking at Wade's face, she knew she wasn't. He wouldn't, she said, not over a food contract. He might. Men like that. He stopped, started again. My father dealt with the railroad twice. Once over land access, once over a water rights issue the line ran through. Both times, when he didn't give them what they wanted, things got complicated. He set the wire down again. He lost both times. Not because he was wrong, but because they had more room to take a loss than he did. The words settled in the hot afternoon air. They were not comfortable words. They were true ones. Then I need to find leverage of my own before I counter, Evelyn said. That night she was awake until 1 a.m, sitting at the kitchen table. Not the ledger this time, a blank piece of paper with a single question at the top, written and underlined. What does Victor Sloan not have that he needs? She thought about the 4 camps he'd mentioned. 2 spur lines east, 1 main line north. She thought about what the Flat Creek camp had looked like before she started running food there. 800 men eating from barrels, half the crew with stomach trouble, turnover higher than it should have been because men left operations where the conditions were bad. A hungry crew was a slower crew. A slow crew cost money on a construction timeline. Sloan needed food service. He needed it reliably, at volume, across multiple remote camps simultaneously. That wasn't something you built from scratch quickly. That was something you either purchased or built over years. She had built something in 2 months that would take him years to replicate. She wrote that down. Then she thought about what she needed. More leverage, which meant she needed someone who would deal with her directly and honestly, someone who had reason to compete with Continental Western rather than cooperate with it. She thought about something Tom had mentioned in passing 3 weeks earlier, something she'd filed away, that there was a second railroad pushing through the territory from the north. The Pacific Meridian Line, smaller than Continental Western, newer, still expanding. Tom had mentioned it because one of his cousins had gone to work for them. She wrote that down too. Then she went to bed and slept for 5 hours, which was more than she usually got. She met Sloan at the Prescott Hotel 3 days later, not because she had an answer, but because she needed to read him more clearly in a setting that was his, not hers. She went alone. She wore her better dress, not because she wanted to impress him, but because she knew what a man like Sloan saw when he looked at a woman, and she preferred to manage what he was seeing. He was in the hotel's small dining room when she arrived, eating a late breakfast with a younger man she didn't recognize, thin, with a ledger in front of him, who Sloan introduced as Marsh, his assistant. Marsh closed the ledger and moved away from the table without being asked. Another well-trained creature. Mrs. Callahan, Sloan said, rising slightly, a gesture of courtesy that cost him nothing. I wasn't expecting you so soon. I thought about it faster than I expected, she said, and sat down. The hotel dining room was nicer than anything in Cutter's Bend. White tablecloths, real silverware, a waiter who refilled her water glass without being asked. All of it designed to create a particular kind of atmosphere, the kind that made you feel small if you let it. She didn't let it. I have some questions about the contract, she said. Of course. The future camps you mentioned. 2 spur lines east, 1 main line north. What's the timeline on the first spur? He looked at her carefully. Construction begins in September. Camp established August, probably 400 men initially. And the main line north? Spring. That one's larger, closer to 800. She did the math in her head. 3 camps, including Flat Creek, which is already running. If I take your contract as written, I'm serving 1,200 to 1,500 men across 3 sites by next spring. That's the opportunity, yes. At 15 cents per meal, she said. With a cook tent running at the current camp, which serves about 200 of the 800 men there, my practical cap at that camp is around 5 to 600 per day if I expand my capacity. At the new camps without a cook tent, I'd have more of the market. He nodded, watching her. The problem, she said, is that your contract doesn't account for expansion costs. To serve 3 sites, I need more wagons, more staff, more provisions infrastructure. The 15-cent rate doesn't cover that margin. What rate covers it? He said, and his voice was patient, but his eyes were doing something else. A calculation running behind them. 18 cents, she said, non-exclusive. And I need the exclusivity clause removed entirely, or narrowed to continental western sites only. He leaned back slightly. 18 cents narrows our margin considerably. Your margin is irrelevant to me, Mr. Sloan. My margin is what I'm here to protect. She folded her hands on the table. You came to me because building this from scratch costs you more than what you'd pay me at 18 cents. That calculation doesn't change because you want a better deal. He looked at her for a long moment. She could feel him recalibrating again, the same smooth adjustment she'd seen in the yard. But there was something underneath it now that hadn't been there before. Not anger, not quite. More like the specific discomfort of a man who has underestimated someone and is aware of it. The exclusivity is important to us, he said. We can't have our supplier feeding a competitor's workforce. Then we need to define competitor precisely, she said. Timber operations are not your competition. Mining is not your competition. If Pacific Meridian builds a camp in this territory, we can discuss that separately. But a blanket exclusivity that kills my non-railroad business is not acceptable. The name Pacific Meridian landed in the silence between them like a stone in water. She watched the ring spread across his face, the slight tightening around the eyes, the small stillness that told her the name meant something to him. That Pacific Meridian was not an abstract concept, but a real and present concern. She had not gone fishing. She had placed a specific bait in a specific location because she'd thought through where the current would carry it. You've been talking to Pacific Meridian, he said. I know who's operating in this territory, she said, which was not an answer, and both of them knew it. He was quiet for a moment. His breakfast was half-eaten and cold. I need to speak with my people in Cheyenne before I can agree to any rate change. Of course, she said. I'll wait for your response. She stood up. But not indefinitely, Mr. Sloan. I've got a business to run. She left him at his white tablecloth and his cold eggs and walked out of the Prescott Hotel into the Wyoming morning sun, which was strong and indifferent and asked nothing of anybody. She was 2 blocks from the hotel, heading toward the general store for the morning's provision list, when she heard boots behind her and a voice she didn't recognize. Mrs. Callahan. She turned. It was the thin assistant, Marsh, slightly out of breath from hurrying. Mr. Sloan wanted me to give you this, he said, and handed her a small card. He said to tell you that his offer stands as written, and that... He hesitated, and she could see the discomfort of a man who has been given a message he doesn't like delivering. And that the access arrangements at the Flat Creek camp are subject to review at any time. She looked at the card. It was Sloan's business card. Nothing written on it. Tell Mr. Sloan I received his message, she said. Marsh nodded and left. She stood on the board sidewalk with the business card in her hand, and what she felt was not fear exactly. It was the particular cold clarity that comes when something you'd hoped wouldn't happen reveals that it absolutely will. Wade had been right. Sloan was not a man who accepted no and went home. She put the card in her pocket and kept walking. When she got back to the ranch that afternoon, she called everyone together. Wade, Clara, Hector, Tom, Ruth, Anna, Grace, Gertrude, Cass, Bert, Dolan. Everyone who worked the ranch and the food operation, standing in the yard in the afternoon sun. Some of them knew something was wrong from her face. Some of them didn't know yet. She told them about Sloan, about the contract, the counter, the threat wrapped in a business card. She told it plainly, without dramatizing it, because the plain version was dramatic enough on its own. When she finished, the yard was quiet for a moment. Tom spoke first. Can he actually lock us out of the camp, legally? The camp is on railroad land, Evelyn said. Technically, yes. That's not fair, Grace said. She was 23 and still believed in fair as an operating principle, which Evelyn envied without being able to share it. No, Evelyn agreed. It isn't. So what do we do? Clara said. She asked it the way Clara asked everything, without panic, without drama, as a practical question deserving a practical answer. Evelyn had been thinking about this for the entire ride back from town. The answer kept coming back to the same place, the same name, the same risk. It was not a certain thing. It was a gamble with real stakes, the kind where if you lost everything, not just the hand. She looked at the people in her yard, Ruth with her arms crossed and her expression of someone who has survived worse. Hector leaning on the fence with his white mustache and 60 years of working through things behind his eyes. Wade standing a little apart, watching her. Not the panic of a man losing something, but the alertness of a man deciding what to do next. Anna's children were sitting on the porch steps. The boy was throwing pebbles at the water trough, trying to land them in the narrow strip of water visible at the rim. He missed 3 times and hit on the 4th and looked up at his mother with a grin she didn't see because Anna was watching Evelyn. "I have an idea," Evelyn said. She felt the yard go still. "It's a risk," she said. "A real one. If it doesn't work, we're in a worse position than we are now." She paused. "But I think Sloan has made a mistake. He came in assuming I'd be grateful for any deal. When I wasn't, he defaulted to pressure because pressure is what he knows. What he hasn't considered is that pressure works differently on someone who has options." "Do we have options?" Bert said. It was possibly the longest sentence she'd heard from him in 3 months. "We're about to find out," she said. That evening, after the others had gone, she sat with Wade at the kitchen table for the 2nd night in a row. He poured them both coffee and sat down and waited. "Pacific Meridian," she said. He looked at her. "Tom's cousin's outfit. They're pushing north from Colorado. They'll need camps. They'll need food service." She wrapped her hands around the cup. "I don't know anyone there. I don't have a contact. I don't know if they'd deal with a small operation or if their terms would be better than Sloan's." She stopped. "But I know that Sloan's face changed when I said their name. He's afraid of them, or at least he's wary of them, which means they're real competition and they're close enough to matter." Wade was quiet for a moment. "Tom's cousin," he said slowly. "His name's Ellis. I've met him once. He works out of their Colorado office, I think. Could Tom get us a contact? I can ask Tom." He looked at her. "What are you thinking exactly?" "I'm thinking that if Pacific Meridian has even one camp going up in this territory, I should be talking to them. And I'm thinking that if Sloan hears I'm talking to them, his leverage goes down," Wade said. "Or he escalates," she said. "That's the risk. If he hears we're talking to a competitor and it makes him nervous enough, he might move on the camp access before we have anything solid from Pacific Meridian. We could end up with nothing." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. The kitchen clock marked off the seconds. "What's your read on Pacific Meridian?" he said. "Based on what you know." "Almost nothing," she admitted. "I know they're growing. I know Continental Western considers them a threat. I know Tom's cousin chose to work for them over Continental Western when he had the option." She paused. "That last one might mean nothing. Or it might mean they're a better outfit to work for, which might mean they deal more honestly." "Might," he said. "Might," she agreed. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the fire in the stove shifted and settled with a soft sound. Outside, Wyoming was doing what it did at night, existing at vast scale with complete indifference to the small calculations happening inside one ranch kitchen. "Tom leaves at 4 tomorrow morning for the timber run," Wade said. "I'll talk to him before he goes. See if Ellis is reachable." She nodded. She started to get up to clean the cups and he said, "Evelyn." She looked at him. "You handled Sloan right," he said. "In town today, you held your ground." She had not expected it, not because he was unkind, but because he was economical with that kind of thing. She felt it more because of the rarity. "We'll see," she said. "I haven't won anything yet." "No," he agreed. "But you're fighting it right." She took the cups to the sink. Her hands were steady. Her chest was not entirely, but she'd gotten good at keeping the two separate. She washed the cups, dried them, set them on the shelf. She looked at the kitchen, her kitchen, these walls, this stove, this window. With the new glass, she'd replaced herself because the glazier's estimate was too high. 4 months ago, she had arrived here with $43 and a cast iron skillet and the quiet terror of someone stepping off a cliff and hoping there was something below. There was something below. She had built it herself, piece by piece, and now someone was trying to take it from her. She turned out the lamp and went to bed, and lay in the dark listening to Wyoming breathe, and thought about a man named Ellis she'd never met, and a company that might or might not be willing to deal, and whether 4 months of building something real was enough to survive what was coming. She didn't sleep for a long time. When she did, she dreamed of the kitchen at the boarding house in St. Louis. Gray walls, a window that faced a brick alley, the sound of 12 men who never learned her name. She woke up before the dream finished. That was fine. She didn't need to know how it ended. She already knew how this one would. Tom talked to Ellis on a Friday. He rode into Cutter's Bend after the morning timber run, sent a telegraph to the Pacific Meridian office in Fort Collins, and had a reply by mid-afternoon, faster than any of them had expected, which either meant Ellis was at his desk or meant Pacific Meridian ran a tighter operation than most. The reply was 4 words: available Monday, wire address. Tom came back to the ranch with the telegram and handed it to Evelyn with the expression of a man who has done something he's proud of and is trying not to show it too obviously. She read it again, and set it on the kitchen table. Monday, she said. Ellis is good people, Tom said. I know I've only met him the once, but he's not the kind to jerk you around. I don't need him to be good people, Evelyn said. I need him to be interested. She spent Saturday writing the telegraph she would send Monday morning. She wrote 9 versions of it, which was 8 more than she usually needed for anything, and the problem with each version was the same problem. She was trying to communicate value and urgency without communicating desperation, and the line between those two things was thinner than she liked. Too aggressive, and Ellis would wonder what she was running from. Too casual, and he might not take it seriously enough to act quickly. The version she landed on was 61 words. It described the operation: 2 wagons, current volume, established routes, experienced staff. Made clear she was exploring partnerships and asked for a meeting at their earliest convenience. She did not mention Sloan. She did not mention the threat. She sent it Monday morning at 7 and spent the rest of the day managing provisions and trying not to watch the clock. The reply came Tuesday afternoon. Ellis would send his operations man, a fellow named Hobart, to meet with her Thursday in Cutter's Bend. 2 days. She had 2 days to figure out what she wanted to ask for. She was still working that out Wednesday evening when Hendricks rode up to the ranch. She knew from his face before he got off his horse that it wasn't a social call. Hendricks was not a man who made social calls. He was too busy and too practical for it. He rode with the look of someone carrying something heavy that he hadn't chosen to carry. He dismounted in the yard. Wade came out of the barn and they stood together, the 3 of them, in the last of the afternoon light. I got a directive this morning, Hendricks said. He was looking at Evelyn, not Wade. He had the decency to look at her directly. From regional operations. Sloan's office. She waited. Outside food vendors on continental western camp property are suspended pending a safety and hygiene review. He said the words like he was reading them, flat and careful. Starting Friday. The yard was very quiet. How long is the review? She said. It doesn't say. He turned his hat in his hands. The same gesture Tom used, she noticed. The gesture of a man who is uncomfortable with the message he's delivering. Evelyn, Mrs. Callahan, I want you to know I had nothing to do with this. I sent a reply to Sloan's office saying your operation was clean, your food was safe. There were no hygiene concerns whatsoever. They didn't respond. No, she said. They wouldn't. Hendricks looked miserable in the efficient, contained way of a practical man who has run out of practical solutions. I'm sorry, he said. I mean that. I know you do, she said. Thank you for coming to tell me yourself. He rode away. She stood in the yard after the sound of his horse faded, the empty air settling around her, and she thought about the numbers. Friday was 2 days away. The Flat Creek camp accounted for roughly 60% of their weekly revenue. Without it, the operation could survive, barely, on the timber crew alone. But the margin would be thin, and if Sloan's office decided to pursue the timber company's contracts next, or if the review dragged on for weeks, that margin would disappear. Wade stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He was good at that, at being present without filling the silence with things that wouldn't help. He moved fast, she said. He knew you were stalling, Wade said. I wasn't stalling. I was building a position. I know. He paused. He doesn't know the difference. He just knows you didn't take the deal. She turned and walked back to the kitchen. She had a meeting on Thursday and she needed to be ready for it. The meeting with Hobart happened at the Prescott Hotel, the same dining room where she'd sat across from Sloane 6 days earlier, which struck her as either ironic or fitting, and she didn't have energy to decide which. Hobart was nothing like Sloane. He was younger, maybe 35, with a sunburned face and the working clothes of someone who spent time in the field rather than behind a desk. He had a handshake that was brief and genuine rather than performative. He ordered coffee and looked at her with the direct attention of someone who values his own time and assumes other people value theirs. "Tom says you run a solid operation," he said. "Tom's biased," she said. "He works for me." Hobart almost smiled. "What aren't you telling me?" She had decided on the ride into town that she was going to tell him everything, because men like Hobart, she had identified the type correctly, she was fairly sure, responded better to full honesty than to a managed presentation, and because she was tired of managing presentations. It used energy she needed for other things. She told him about the operation, the growth, Sloane's offer, the counter, the camp ban. She told it in order, factually, without inflection designed to make herself look better than she was. When she finished, Hobart drank his coffee and was quiet for a moment. "So, Continental Western shut you out of the camp," he said, 2 days ago. "And you're looking for a contract that gives you enough volume to compensate." "I'm looking for a contract that makes sense for both sides," she said. "I'm not going to take a bad deal from you because I'm in a tight spot. I'd rather find another way through than sign something that costs me more than it gains." He looked at her steadily. "What are your terms?" 18 cents per meal served, no exclusivity except at Pacific Meridian's own campsites. 2-year rate lock. 60-day notice required before either party terminates. She folded her hands. "In exchange, I can be operational at your first Wyoming camp within 3 weeks of you giving me a start date, and I can scale to any camp under 1,000 men without advance notice." 3 weeks, he repeated. "I built this twice in 6 months. I know how to do it." He turned his coffee cup. She had learned that men who were thinking turned something in their hands, and she waited it out. "We've got a camp going up north of here," he said. 60 miles. It'll have 600 men by September. We've been trying to figure out the food situation since April." He looked at her. "We've been trying to build it ourselves. It's not going well." "It doesn't," she said. "It looks simple until you're trying to do it for 600 men 3 times a day." "No," he said. "It does not." He set his cup down. "I need to wire Fort Collins before I can agree to terms. But I want you to know that what you're describing, the rate, the terms, none of that's unreasonable from our side. We expected to pay more to build it ourselves." She kept her face even. "When can you have a response?" 48 hours, he said. "Maybe less." She rode back to the ranch and found the yard different than she'd left it. The wagons were in their usual spots, but no one was loading them because there was nothing to load for. Friday's Flat Creek run had been canceled, the first canceled run since the first Friday 4 months ago when she'd driven out to the camp and served 91 men and counted the money on the fold-down counter. Tom was sitting on the fence, doing nothing with the particular restlessness of a young man whose purpose has been temporarily removed. Anna's children were quieter than usual, picking up on something in the air the way children do. Clara met her at the kitchen door. "Ruth cried this morning," she said quietly. "She thought I didn't see." "I did." Evelyn absorbed that. Ruth, who had cooked for a logging camp for 20 years and whose husband had died, and who had rebuilt her life at 61 with the kind of grim practicality that doesn't leave much room for tears. "I'll talk to her," Evelyn said. "She doesn't need talking to," Clara said. "She needs the work back." "I know." Evelyn went inside. "I'm working on it." The 48 hours were the longest of the 4 months. She kept the operation running on the timber crew route, Tuesday, Thursday, the long drive north, the partial cook and finish at the fire ring. But the revenue was less than half of what they'd been doing, and everyone could feel it. The mood in the kitchen was different, quieter, the small jokes and navigations of a group of people who found their working rhythm temporarily replaced by the careful movements of people who are worried and trying not to show it around each other. Gertrude broke a pot on the second day, dropped it carrying it from the stove, and it didn't break. It was cast iron, but it clattered on the floor with a sound that made everyone in the kitchen flinch, and Gertrude stood there looking at it with her hand over her mouth, and Evelyn came over and picked it up herself and said, "It's fine. No harm." And Gertrude nodded and went back to work, but there were tears at the corners of her eyes for the next hour. Evelyn saw it and said nothing and kept working. There was nothing to say. The waiting was the hardest part, and she was the one who had to hold the shape of the thing while everyone else was afraid. And the way to do that was not through speeches or reassurance, but through action, through being visibly in motion, through the simple communication of someone who has not stopped trying. She sent a second telegraph to Hobart on the second morning, not to push, but to update him on the camp ban being confirmed extended. Hendricks had sent word that Sloane's office had communicated no timeline for the review's end. Information, not pressure. She needed him to understand what the situation was. The reply came not from Hobart, but from a name she didn't recognize: Alderman, Pacific Meridian, Fort Collins. And it was longer than she'd expected. She read it standing at the telegraph office in Cutter's Bend with the operator pretending not to watch her face. Pacific Meridian acknowledged the proposal. They had concerns about the scale. Could one operation reliably service multiple camps simultaneously? And they wanted to understand the staffing structure before committing. They were not saying no. They were not saying yes. They were asking questions that a company asked when it was seriously considering something and needed to cover its uncertainty before committing. She wrote the reply in her head on the ride home. By the time she got to the ranch, she had it fully formed. She turned Ruth's horse around at the gate and rode back to the telegraph office and sent it. The full staffing list, the current capacity numbers, a description of how the two-wagon system worked, and how it could be scaled to 3 or 4 with the same structure. 600 men, she wrote, was not a different problem than 200 men. It was the same problem done 3 times, and she had staff who knew how to do it. She sent it and went home and made supper and did not tell anyone what she'd sent because there was nothing to tell yet. That night, Wade found her on the porch after supper, the same porch where she'd first told him the idea 4 months and a different lifetime ago. He brought 2 cups of coffee and sat on the step with his and handed her the other. The Wyoming night was enormous around them, stars doing their indifferent burning, the creek making its small sound to the east. "How bad is it?" he said. "Honestly?" "Always." She wrapped her hands around the cup. "If Pacific Meridian says no, or if they take too long, we're going to start cutting into reserves. Another 2 weeks at timber-only revenue, and I have to make decisions about staff." She felt the words physically, the weight of them. "I'm not going to let people go without warning, but I might have to talk to them about it." Wade was quiet. "And if Sloane comes back with a different offer?" "He won't," she said. "Not yet. He thinks he's winning. He'll wait until he thinks I'm desperate enough to take what he offered originally." "Are you?" She looked at her coffee. "Not yet," she said. "Close. Not yet." He nodded. He drank his coffee and looked at the dark. "I talked to the bank man today," he said. "Ferris. In town." She looked at him. She hadn't known he'd gone to town. "I wanted to know where we stood if we needed to restructure the loan," he said. "If the food operation took a significant loss, what our options were." He paused. "Ferris says the cattle market is moving. Beef prices are up from last quarter. If we sold 6 head in the next month at current prices, we could cover 2 months of operating costs." "That's your cattle," she said. "It's our cattle." He said it without emphasis, which somehow made it more significant. "I'm telling you it's an option, not the first one, but it's there." She looked at his profile in the dark, the square jaw, the lines at the corners of his eyes that she hadn't noticed at the train station 4 months ago because she'd been too busy reading for threat. He was not a demonstrative man. She had known that from the first week. But he showed up in the ways that mattered: the cold storage he'd agreed to expand, the spring he'd fixed on the wagon, and now this, a quiet trip to the bank to understand their options so she'd have one more card to play if she needed it. He showed up. "Thank you," she said. He shrugged, which was his way of saying, "You're welcome." They sat in the dark a while longer, not talking, which was something she had come to understand was its own kind of conversation between people who'd been through enough together to know that silence doesn't always need to be filled. She went to bed at 10. She was asleep by 10:15, which surprised her, and she slept without dreaming until 4 when she woke and lay in the dark and listened to the ranch breathe around her and thought about the telegraph office opening at 8 and whether there would be a reply waiting. There was. She was at the office at 8:05. The operator, a young man named Chet, who had watched this woman come and go for weeks and had developed the professional discretion not to show curiosity, handed her the message with a look that gave nothing away. It was from Alderman, and read it. Read it again. Pacific Meridian was prepared to enter negotiations for a service contract. They proposed a meeting in Fort Collins at the company's earliest convenience, or alternatively, they could send a representative to Cutter's Bend within the week if Mrs. Callahan preferred to negotiate on home ground. They had reviewed her capacity description and found it credible. They were interested in discussing the Wyoming camp and potentially 2 additional sites in Colorado if the initial arrangement proved satisfactory. 2 additional sites in Colorado. She read that sentence 3 times. Then she folded the telegram carefully, put it in her dress pocket against her chest, and walked out into the Wyoming morning. The sun was already strong, the kind of June morning that reminds you summer in this country doesn't ask permission. The main street of Cutter's Bend was coming alive around her, the general store opening, a wagon coming in from the east, 2 men talking outside the livery. She stood on the board sidewalk for a moment, the telegram against her chest, and let herself feel what she felt. Not triumph, not yet. It wasn't triumph yet. There was still a negotiation to survive, still terms to agree on, still the possibility that Sloan would do something else before she had anything solid in hand. She knew better than to celebrate a door opening before she'd walked through it, but it had opened. She walked to her horse, untied her from the post, and rode back to the ranch at a pace that was slightly faster than necessary. When she came through the gate, Tom was in the yard and he looked up, and she didn't say anything, but something in her face made him straighten off the fence post he'd been leaning on. She tied the horse and went to find Wade. He was in the barn, and he looked up from the harness he was checking when she came in, and she pulled the telegram from her pocket and held it out. He took it, read it. His face did the thing it did when something was better than expected, the quiet loosening she'd first seen at the supper table 4 months ago, the one he never let get all the way to expression. He read it a second time. Colorado, he said. Colorado, she said. He folded the telegram and handed it back. He looked at her for a moment, and what was in his face was not the assessing look of the train platform or the careful watchfulness of the early weeks. It was something that had no name she'd assigned to it yet, but that she recognized, the way you recognize a sound you've heard before without being able to say where. We need to go to Fort Collins, he said. She blinked. I was going to send Hobart a reply. Have him come here. No, Wade said. We go to them. You've been negotiating from a position of pressure. You go to them, on their ground. It shows you're not running scared. He paused. Also, I know Fort Collins a little. I've done business there. It helps to know a place. She looked at him. We, she said. You built this, he said. But you shouldn't have to walk into that room alone. She had been alone in a lot of rooms. She had managed, but she looked at her husband standing in the barn with a harness in his hands and the sun coming through the old boards in dusty shafts around him, and she thought that managing alone and not having to were different things, and that she'd been so focused on the former for so long that she'd almost forgotten the latter was possible. All right, she said. We go to Fort Collins. When? She thought about it. I need 2 days to make sure the timber run is covered while we're gone. Clara can manage, and I need to wire Hobart to set the meeting. Day after tomorrow, then. Day after tomorrow, she said. She walked back to the kitchen to start the day's work, and partway across the yard she stopped and stood still for a moment in the morning sun. She thought about the telegram in her pocket and the road ahead and the possibility that was not yet a certainty, but was closer to one than anything had been in the past 2 weeks. She thought about Sloan in his hotel, waiting for her to run out of options. She thought, not yet, not close. Then she went inside and started the fire. The road to Fort Collins took 2 days. They left before dawn on a Thursday, Wade driving the buckboard and Evelyn beside him with the telegram in her pocket and a leather satchel on her lap containing the ledger, the staffing records, the capacity notes she'd written and rewritten 3 times the night before. Clara had come to the porch to see them off, still in her robe, and had said nothing useful, just squeezed Evelyn's hand once and gone back inside. That was Clara's version of a speech. The first day they made good time. The road south was better than the road to the timber camp, flatter, and the horses were fresh. They didn't talk much. Evelyn worked through the satchel papers in the first hour, reading her own numbers until she knew them well enough to recite them backwards, then put the satchel down and watched Wyoming go by. The grassland, the distances, the sky that out here seemed to belong to a different scale than the sky anywhere else she'd lived. At midday, they stopped at a creek crossing to water the horses. Evelyn got down and stretched her back and looked at the water moving over stones, clear and cold, and Wade stood beside her with his hat off, squinting at the sky with the particular weather-reading expression she recognized from mornings on the ranch. "Rain tonight," he said. "We'll be at the Larson station by dark," she said. It was a way station, a stopping point for travelers, halfway to Fort Collins. She'd confirmed it with the telegraph operator before they left. "I know." He put his hat back on. He was quiet for a moment, the way he got quiet when he was working toward something. "I've been thinking about what you said, a few weeks ago, about what the ranch could become versus what it is." She looked at him. And I think you were right," he said. "I've been holding on to the idea of the ranch because my father built it, because it was what we had. But what we have now," he stopped, picked up a stone and turned it in his hand. "What we have now is different, bigger. And I think I've been slow about understanding that." It was a long admission for Wade Callahan. She knew what it cost him. "The ranch is still the ranch," she said. "That doesn't change. The ranch is the foundation," he said. "What you've built is the structure on top of it." He threw the stone into the creek. "I should have said that sooner." She wanted to say something useful back but couldn't locate the words quickly enough, so she reached over and put her hand briefly on his arm. 1 second, 2, and then they both went back to the buckboard and got on and kept driving. Some things don't need more than that. The Larson station was exactly as promised. A long, low building with 4 rooms for rent, a stable, and a woman named Mrs. Larson who fed them beef stew that was competent if not inspired. Evelyn ate it and thought professionally about what she would have done differently with the seasoning and then told herself to stop. It rained in the night, hard, drumming on the roof, and she lay awake for part of it thinking about the meeting tomorrow, not with dread exactly, but with the particular alertness of someone who is about to do something that matters and wants to be sharp for it. She thought about Alderman. She'd built a picture of him from the telegrams, careful, methodical, asking the right questions, not someone who moved on feeling. That was fine. She didn't need him to like her. She needed him to see the numbers clearly. She thought about Sloan, still in Cutter's Bend, presumably, still waiting, still confident, she guessed, because men like Sloan stayed confident until the moment they stopped having reason to be, and they were always slightly late in updating that. She thought about her kitchen in St. Louis, the brick alley outside the window. 12 men who never learned her name. She slept eventually and woke when the rain had stopped, and the morning was clean and cold and the road ahead was dry. Pacific Meridian's Fort Collins office was a 2-story brick building on the main commercial street, newer than most of the buildings around it, with the company name in clean lettering above the door. It looked like a company that was growing and knew it. Alderman met them in a conference room on the 2nd floor. He was older than Hobart, 60s, with a white beard trimmed precisely, and the manner of someone who has run large operations long enough to be comfortable in rooms with anyone. He shook Wade's hand and then Evelyn's with the same grip. There was a third man in the room, introduced as Fenton, their Wyoming territory manager, a broad, quiet man who reminded her somewhat of Bert in his economy of expression. He would be the one, she understood, who would actually manage the relationship if they made a deal. They sat down. Alderman had a copy of her telegrams in front of him, she noticed, printed out, annotated in the margins in neat, small handwriting. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, "tell me about your operation, not the numbers, I have those. Tell me how it actually works." She told him. She told him the way she'd told Clara the idea months ago. Plainly, in sequence, without overselling, acknowledging the problems alongside the solutions. The wagon builds, the staffing model, the cold storage question, the scaling from 1 wagon to 2, the challenges of the 15-mile timber run and how they'd address them. She talked for 20 minutes and Alderman listened with the focused attention of someone who is actually listening, not waiting for his turn to speak. When she finished, Fenton leaned forward. "The staff, the women you've hired, they're reliable?" "Ruth cooked for a logging camp for 20 years, Evelyn said. Clara ran her own household for 30. Anna came to me with nothing and learned faster than anyone I've trained. Grace bakes better than I do." She paused. "They're reliable because they need to be and because they're good at it. That combination tends to produce reliable people." Fenton nodded once, Bert style. "The continental western situation," Alderman said. His voice was neutral, neither sympathetic nor prosecutorial. "The camp ban." "Yes," she said. "That's the pressure that brought you to us now rather than 6 months from now." "It is," she said. She didn't dress it up. "I want to be honest about that because you'll figure it out anyway, and I'd rather you hear it from me. Sloan offered a contract with an exclusivity clause and a rate I couldn't accept. When I countered, he used his leverage at the camp. That's the situation." Alderman looked at his annotated telegrams for a moment. "Victor Sloan," he said, with the particular flatness of a man saying the name of someone he knows. "We've dealt with him before in Colorado 2 years ago. Different circumstances, same approach." He looked up. "What's your read on him?" "He's not stupid," she said. "He knew what my operation was worth before I did. He offered me less than it was worth because he thought I didn't know, and when I showed him I did, he went to pressure instead of to a fair offer." She held his eyes. "That tells me he's not actually that good a negotiator. Good negotiators don't have to use pressure that early." Alderman's expression didn't change, but something in it warmed slightly. Beside her, she felt Wade very still in the way he got still when he was listening carefully. "What terms are you looking for?" Alderman said. She laid them out. 18 cents, no exclusivity, 2-year rate lock, 60-day termination notice. The same terms she'd given Sloan and Hobart both. She didn't change them for this room because the terms were right, and she'd done the math enough times to know they were right. Alderman looked at Fenton. Something passed between them in the way of two people who have worked together long enough to communicate without speaking. 18 cents is workable, Alderman said. The exclusivity, we're not interested in exclusivity. We don't do business that way. He said it like it was a simple statement of policy, not a negotiating position, and she believed him. The rate lock and termination terms are standard for us. No issue. She absorbed that. All of it, essentially as she'd asked. The Wyoming camp starts in August, Fenton said. We need service running by September 1st. Can you do that? Yes, she said. And the Colorado sites, we have 2 possible expansions, but they won't be confirmed until fall. We'd want to formalize those separately when the timing is clear. Agreed, she said. Alderman leaned back. We'll have a formal contract drafted within the week. Fenton will send it to you directly. He paused. Mrs. Callahan, you mentioned you've been running this operation since April. Late April, yes. And before that? I cooked in a boarding house in St. Louis. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone doing arithmetic that surprises them. 4 months, he said. 4 months, she agreed. He nodded slowly. Not admiration. She didn't need admiration from him, but recognition. The recognition of someone who has built things and understands what it takes. They shook hands, all 4 of them. Fenton's handshake was the same as Bert's, brief, firm, meaning everything it needed to mean. She and Wade were back on the street in 45 minutes. The sun was fully up now, Fort Collins going about its business around them, freight wagons and storefronts and the sound of a city that had been here long enough to stop being surprised by itself. Wade stood beside her on the sidewalk, and she stood there with the satchel on her arm and the contract terms in her head and tried to locate what she felt. It wasn't triumph. She'd been wrong earlier, thinking that's what it would feel like. It felt more like completion, maybe. Like a number that had been running in her head since the first Friday at the camp had finally, quietly, added itself up. Well, Wade said. Well, she said. He looked at her with that look she had finally named, somewhere on the road down. It wasn't admiration, though it contained that. It wasn't love in the simple version, though it contained that too. The early version of it. The version that is mostly respect and trust and the accumulated weight of 4 months of sharing a table and a problem and a set of stubborn, practical choices. It was the look of a man who has found himself beside someone he did not expect and has decided, without ceremony, to stay. You hungry? He said. Starving, she said. They found a diner 2 streets over and ate eggs and biscuits, and she ate hers, and about half of his because he didn't finish it, and she was hungrier than she'd realized, and they didn't talk much, just sat in a Fort Collins diner with the morning sun coming through the window, and the contract terms settled in the air between them like something finally at rest. They drove home the following day, and they arrived back at the Callahan Ranch in the late afternoon, and before the buckboard was fully stopped in the yard, Clara was on the porch with her arms crossed and a question on her face that she didn't put into words. Evelyn climbed down and looked at her. "We have a contract," she said. Clara looked at the sky for a moment with the expression of someone who has been holding something tightly and has decided to let go of it. Then she looked back at Evelyn. "I'll put the beans on," she said, and went inside. That was Clara. That was exactly Clara. What happened after was not immediate. Nothing real ever is. The contract from Pacific Meridian arrived by courier 11 days later, 11 days during which Evelyn ran the timber route and managed costs carefully and waited with the patience of someone who has learned that impatience doesn't accelerate anything except the rate at which you make mistakes. When the document arrived, she read it at the kitchen table with Wade beside her and a cup of coffee going cold. The terms were as discussed. She signed it. Wade signed it as a witness. She sent it back. 2 days after the signed contract left on the courier, Hendricks rode out to the ranch again. Different face this time. Less heavy. "The safety review on outside vendors has been concluded," he said. "No issues found. You can resume service at the Flat Creek camp starting Monday." She looked at him. "Did Sloan's office send that?" "It came from regional operations, yes." He paused. "I also heard, this is information, not official business, that there have been some questions raised about Mr. Sloan's conduct in the territory, from above his level. Something about irregular use of vendor suspension authority." He turned his hat in his hands. "I don't know the details. I just know the review is over." She thanked him. He rode away. She stood in the yard for a long moment, thinking about that, about what it meant and how it had happened, and whether she'd had anything to do with it. She thought about Alderman's expression when she'd said Sloan's name. We've dealt with him before. A company with Pacific Meridian's resources and history with Sloan's tactics would know who to call and what to say. She had not asked for that. She had not needed to. Some consequences are set in motion by doing the right thing in the right room. You don't always get to see them play out, and when you do, they usually look quieter than you'd imagined. She went inside and started planning Monday's menu. The following months were hard in the specific way that growth is hard. More to manage, more decisions, more of everything that had been big becoming bigger until the question of what you could hold in your head at once was a genuine daily challenge. The Pacific Meridian, Wyoming camp came online in September, 600 men as promised, and the Callahan operation ran 3 wagons to cover it alongside the Flat Creek camp and the timber crew. Evelyn hired 2 more women before the September start, a pair of sisters from a homestead east of town, both experienced, both quiet in the way that meant they worked rather than talked, and expanded the cold storage again, this time with a proper insulated room Hector designed and Bert built over 3 weeks in August. The ranch changed too, in ways that were both practical and harder to name. The debt that had been suffocating it, the bank loan, the lease payments, the slow accumulation of years of not quite making it, began to come down. Not all at once. In pieces. One payment, then another, then one that was made 3 months early because the numbers for October came in higher than projected, and Evelyn sat with the ledger and decided that paying the bank early was worth more than holding the reserve. When the October lease payment went out, on time, full amount, no scramble, Wade sat at the kitchen table that evening and looked at the receipt for a while without saying anything. She left him to it. Some things need to be sat with alone. The women who worked for her found their feet in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. Ruth, who had cried the morning of the camp ban, became the person Evelyn trusted most with the large volume cooking. The person who could look at a bean pot and tell by the smell whether it needed another 20 minutes, who could train the newer hires with the patience of someone who knows both the importance of the work and the cost of doing it badly. Clara became the effective operations manager of the food side, managing schedules and provisions with an organizational precision that Evelyn recognized as better than her own in some areas and was not too proud to use. Anna's children stopped being quiet in the ranch yard. The boy, whose name was Petru, attached himself to Hector with an 8-year-old's absolute commitment, following him through the wagon maintenance and pestering him with questions that Hector answered with a patience he clearly enjoyed having excuse to use. Grace, the 23-year-old who had come to the porch looking for work after a man who didn't come back, married the telegraph operator, young Chet, in November. She kept working. She showed up the Monday after her wedding in her regular clothes with her rolling pin in hand and said, "I'm not stopping," and no one had suggested she should. Evelyn had given them a jar of her blackberry preserves as a wedding gift, and Chet had looked at it like it was the best thing he'd ever received, which might have been because he'd been eating railroad camp biscuits for 2 years and knew firsthand what the preserves represented. Tom stopped being a ranch hand in any real sense and became the logistics manager of the expanded operation, the person who knew the routes, the road conditions, the suppliers' schedules, and the specific mechanical preferences of each wagon with the fluency of someone who had found his calling. He was also still the person most likely to say something that made everyone in the kitchen laugh at the exact wrong moment, which Evelyn had stopped trying to manage and started regarding as a necessary feature of a working group of people. Bert fixed things. He had always fixed things. He continued to fix things, and the ranch ran because of it, quietly and without credit, in the way that essential invisible work usually does. Dolan, the man Wade had hired for the ranch side, turned out to be exactly what Evelyn had predicted. Reliable during the week, his own business on weekends, and useful enough in between that the fence on the south pasture was finally properly rebuilt before winter. He also turned out, unexpectedly, to have a dry humor that revealed itself gradually over months. The kind of humor that is entirely invisible until you've known someone long enough to catch it, at which point you realize it's been there the whole time. Sloane's career did not end dramatically. It ended the way careers like his usually end, through accumulated weight. The questions Alderman's people had raised became a formal inquiry by Continental Western's board into his management practices in the Wyoming Territory, specifically the irregular use of vendor controls for what appeared to be personal negotiating leverage. By December, he had been reassigned to an administrative position in the Chicago office, which was the corporate equivalent of being put in a room with no windows. She heard this through Hendricks, who heard it from someone in the Cheyenne office, who heard it from someone else. The frontier moved information the way water moved, slowly and along whatever channels were available, but it moved. She did not feel satisfaction about it exactly. She had not wanted to destroy him. She had wanted to keep what she'd built, and the two things had turned out to be connected in ways she hadn't controlled. That's how it works sometimes. You defend yourself well, and the consequences of the other person's choices catch up to them on their own schedule. The Colorado contracts came through in February. 2 camps, both smaller than Wyoming, both within a week's drive. She negotiated the terms directly with Fenton, whom she'd come to like in the specific way you like someone who is consistently honest in a business context, which is rarer than it should be. She expanded the operation again. A 4th wagon, built over winter by Hector with Paytrue underfoot the entire time, asking questions that were now actually useful since Hector had been answering them for 4 months. The ranch debt was paid off in March, 4 months before the original target date Evelyn had written at the top of her ledger the night she'd done the first serious projections. She sat with that for a while. The ledger page, the number she'd written, the line she'd drawn under it. Wade saw her looking at it and came to sit beside her at the kitchen table, and she showed him the page, and he looked at it, and neither of them said anything for a minute. "Your father built this ranch," she said finally. "He did," Wade said. "And now it's—" She looked for the word. "Ours," he said. Simple. No performance in it. She looked at him. He looked back at her. And the thing that had been building between them since a train platform in Cutter's Bend, since a 7-minute marriage in a justice of the peace office, since 2 cups of coffee on a porch and a conversation about risk, and since all the intervening months of working beside each other through hard things. That thing was no longer nameless. She knew what it was. She thought he did too, and the fact that neither of them said it that day didn't matter, because it didn't need to be said. Some things are more real for existing in the doing of them than in the naming. She thought sometimes, in the quieter moments of the morning before the ranch woke up and the work began again, about what the past year had actually been. Not the business narrative of it. She knew that story. She could recite every turning point, but the human shape of it. What it had cost and what it had given. It had cost her sleep and certainty and the comfort of not risking anything. It had cost her the version of herself that had arrived at Cutter's Bend with $43 and her mother's skillet and the quiet terror of someone who had never been allowed to find out what she was capable of. She didn't mourn that version. She understood her. She had needed her back when survival required smallness. But she had outgrown her the way you outgrow a winter coat. Not by force, but by becoming too much yourself to fit inside it anymore. What it had given her was harder to inventory. Ruth's steady hands, Clara's brisk competence and occasional rare laugh, Anna's children in the yard, Tom's voice from the wagon complaining about the road conditions with a cheerfulness that made even legitimate complaints sound like entertainment, Bert's silences that held more in them than most people's speeches. Hector and the boy bent over wagon wheels together in the afternoon light. Wade, at the kitchen table, reading a livestock report he wasn't actually reading while he watched her work. Wade on the buckboard to Fort Collins, saying "we" without being asked. Wade's hand on a receipt, holding it like it meant something, because it did. She had come to Wyoming to survive. She had found something she hadn't known to look for. Not just survival, not just success by the numbers, but the particular satisfaction of building something real out of materials that weren't supposed to be enough. Out of a broken stove and a $50 wagon, and the stubborn conviction that she knew what she was doing even before she had proof. The proof came. It always does, for people willing to stay long enough to see it. One morning in April, a year, almost to the week, from her arrival at Cutter's Bend, Evelyn was in the kitchen at 4 o'clock starting the bread dough, the ranch dark and quiet around her, the fire going in the stove. The window showed her the sky beginning its slow change from black to gray, the first light that belongs more to the night than the day, but is already, quietly, something else. She worked the dough with her hands, the familiar weight and resistance of it, the repetitive motion that her body knew by heart. The cast iron skillet hung on its hook. The ledger sat on the shelf, current, balanced, the numbers inside it telling a story she had written herself. She heard boots on the stairs. Wade, earlier than usual. He came into the kitchen, squinted at the lamplight, went to the coffee pot without speaking. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep." He poured coffee, leaned against the counter watching her work the dough. "What are you thinking about?" She considered the question honestly, which she always did with him now. "About next year," she said. "The Colorado sites are running well. Fenton's been talking about 2 more possible locations farther south. If those come through..." She turned the dough. "We're going to need to think about how we structure this differently. It's getting too big to run the way we've been running it." He nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about that too." And I think you need a proper business name," he said. "Not just the Callahan operation or the food wagons. Something real." She stopped working the dough for a moment and looked at him. "You've been thinking about that specifically?" "Since February," he said. Not embarrassed, just honest. "You built something that's going to outlast the 2 of us if it keeps going the way it's going. Things like that deserve a name." She looked at the dough in her hands. She thought about it. "Mercer," she said. "My name." He raised an eyebrow. "Before I was Callahan, I was Mercer," she said. "And I was a Mercer when I had the idea. Before I had the wagon, before I had anything." She met his eyes. "Mercer Provisions. What do you think?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I think it's right," he said. She went back to the dough. The bread needed another 10 minutes before it went in the pan, and then 40 in the oven, and by then the rest of the ranch would be waking up, and the day would begin its familiar claiming of time and attention, and all of it. The work, the people, the numbers, the road, the ongoing negotiations with a world that didn't give anything away without a fight, would continue. Outside, the Wyoming sky had made its decision. The darkness was going. What was coming wasn't soft or romantic. It was just light, cold and clear and honest, flooding the flat country the way it always had, indifferent to what had been built in the valley below, indifferent to the struggling and the trying and the eventual, hard-won not failing. But the light came anyway. It always came. And in the kitchen of the Callahan Ranch, a woman named Evelyn put her bread in the oven and started on the biscuits, and the day began.